Last month, Pew Research Center launched the 8th edition of its political Typology, which organizes the U.S. public into 9 distinct groups based on an analysis of Americans' political values and attitudes. Those 9 groups include, on the right, faith and flag conservatives, committed conservatives, the populist right, and the ambivalent right. On the left, there's outsider left, Democratic mainstays, establishment liberals, and the progressive left. And in the middle are the stressed sideliners.
Here to expand on Pew's new political typology and help us dig into Pew's first study conducted along these new guidelines is Andrew Daniller. He's a research associate at Pew. Andrew, welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me.
And so what was what type of research were you able to draw on to come up with these typologies, and what makes this different from, say, like a New York Times kind of riffing on typologies?
Yeah, so the basis of this report is a survey we conducted in July of this year on our American Trends panel, which is our main source of public opinion data for the United States at this point in time. And we surveyed a group of just over 10,000 Americans. And we also drew on questions that came from a number of other surveys conducted primarily this year, but with a couple dating back to the Democratic primaries in early 2020. And so we were able to draw from a number of different surveys, all of the same set of people. And we were able to identify just about 30 attitudes or values that we think are really important in defining the political landscape today. And so we were able, after looking at a lot of different statistical models, we were able to identify these 9 groups as a way of looking beyond just the 2 parties at some of the divisions within the parties themselves and some of the ways that Democrats might not agree on some of the issues and ways that Republicans might not agree on some of the issues today.
This is so fun and interesting. Can you give us a little bit of information about each of these different categories? I know a lot of us watching are like, oh, which one, where do I fit in this?
Right. So I will say for anyone watching, we do have a quiz up on our website at pewresearch.org where you can actually take a survey based on the survey we ran in July that will sort you into one of the 9 groups. But in terms of talking about the groups, it's helpful to think of the 2-party coalitions. And so, for example, on the Republican side, there's agreement on some basic values, some basic approaches to what government should look like. Within each of those Republican groups, large majorities believe in a smaller government, and they believe in a strong military as the cornerstone of foreign policy. Whereas on the Democratic side, there's an emphasis on a bigger government and a stronger social safety net, as well as on a need for increased action to promote racial and ethnic equality in the United States. Where the groups differ, though, is often more interesting. So in the Republican groups, for example, we have the faith and flag conservatives, who are in a lot of ways the most conservative group in the study. The faith and flag conservatives differ from some of the other Republican groups insofar as they believe that there should be a strong role for religion in government policy, that religion should inform government policy. And not surprisingly, this is a group that believes in restrictions on abortion. They're more skeptical of same-sex marriage, other things that we might think of as social issues that relate to religious values. By comparison, the committed conservatives see less of a role for religion, even though they're just as conservative on a broad range of issues as the faith and flag conservatives. So both groups believe that there should be either that taxes should stay where they are on the wealthy and on large corporations, or that taxes should even be a little bit lower than they are today. The populist right stands out from that insofar as the populist right is a very conservative group in most respects that is skeptical of big business in the country today and skeptical of the way the economic system works. So that gives you just a very quick look at how some of these groups differ.
And so which of the 2 parties to you has more internal contradictions within their own coalition?
Yeah, one thing that we see, at least this time around, and as you said, this is the 8th edition of this study, is that there aren't necessarily more divisions on one side than on the other, but the divisions are a little bit different in their nature. Among Republicans, we're seeing more disagreement about some basic issues. As I mentioned, taxes are a point of disagreement for the populist right versus some of these other groups. Immigration would be another one, where the ambivalent right in particular has somewhat different attitudes on on immigration policy than some of these other conservative groups. Among Democrats, we're seeing a lot of agreement on basic policies right now, but there are big differences in the intensity of some of those preferences. So I mentioned earlier that a big point of agreement among the groups in the Democratic coalition is the need for additional government action for racial and ethnic equality. However, when we asked a follow-up question, there were two groups in particular that said because so many US laws and institutions are fundamentally biased against certain groups, most US laws and institutions need to be completely rebuilt. That's the progressive left and the outsider left. Both of those groups, majorities said this. However, in the other two Democratic-oriented group, the establishment liberals and the Democratic mainstays, larger shares said that while there are many inequities in U.S. laws and institutions, it's possible to work through the current system to make the needed changes. So as I said, that's kind of a different way of disagreeing, a different type of a disagreement than a lot of what we're seeing among Republicans right now.
So fascinating. So you're finding that, just to kind of be clear on that the infighting, would you say, is more intense on the left or the right? Are you seeing, I see that there's these differences, and you've explained this really, really well, but the actual kind of internal civil war, where would you say that's really having it out right now?
Well, so part of what we're doing is looking at public opinion through the surveys. And so it's hard for me to comment on whether fighting's more intense on one side or the other. I mean, that's something where you see, some of what's going on Capitol Hill right now, as opposed to when we're looking at public opinion surveys. What I would really say is that there are important disagreements on both sides. And so when you're looking at something like the upcoming midterm elections, it's important for both parties to be able to turn out people from each of these different groups. And for Republicans to mobilize, for example, the ambivalent right, which is a group on the right side of the spectrum that is less likely to turn out to vote, they're going to have to do some different things than Democrats will have to do to turn out their outsider left, which is kind of the group in the same position, lower propensity to vote, a little bit younger than other members of the coalition. And so I would view it less as about infighting, at least in terms of public opinion, and more about what are these different groups looking for and what can the parties do to mobilize them, to encourage them to participate.
Which of these typologies do you think are most up for grabs to switch to another party as we kind of realign along?
Sure. Yeah, so the stressed sideliners group are definitely the closest thing we see to a group that we would call swing voters. Almost equal numbers of the stressed sideliners identify as either Democrats or lean towards the Democratic Party, and identify as Republicans or lean to the Republican Party. And the stressed sideliners make up a significant portion of both party coalitions. So these are people who we see as being much less politically involved, much less politically engaged than those in some of the other groups. Just under half of them voted in 2020, which was, of course, was a relatively high turnout election. And so to the extent that either party is able to get more of the stressed sideliners to vote and to vote for them, that could potentially be an advantage down the road. Of course, part of the reason that we describe these people as stressed sideliners is not just because they're less politically engaged, but because they do seem to be a little bit more focused on some of the pocketbook economic issues than other groups. This is a group where large numbers of people are expressing concern about their own financial situations compared to those in some of the other groups. And so that's, of course, something that the political parties would presumably be looking at in trying to win some support there.
Any guesses where I am or where Kim is?
Well, if you know us well enough.
No, I don't want to place anybody in groups. I will say that, as I said, the quiz is out there. We think it's a great tool, not just for figuring out where you stand, but for comparing yourself to the population as a whole, and for comparing within groups. So, for example, the entire Hill TV staff could take the quiz, and you could take a look at how you compared to the rest of the population as a whole.
And the quizzes like this are always frustrating because you want like a slightly different answer to be in there, but that's not how a typology works. You don't get, you don't, and it often ends up figuring it out, even though you think like the precise answer you wanted isn't necessarily in there.
We do ask some survey questions where our respondents will say, hey, wait a minute, I want a third option that's somewhere in the middle. But one thing we did in this typology compared to some of our previous efforts, we use less of those questions that really force you into one response or the other. We were able to mix up the survey questions this time around, and part of the ability to do that comes from the fact that we were using our online panel this time, which, conducting surveys online, there are some advantages, there are some disadvantages, but one advantage is that we can use a lot of different question formats that don't necessarily work in a traditional over-the-phone survey. So hopefully taking this quiz, you won't feel that way quite as much as you might have with our last edition of Typology.
So I just quickly took the test. It was 16 questions long. So I just kind of went through. I mean, I was paying attention to you, so I didn't really pay that much attention to the test. So this might not be accurate. I'll have to retake it. But the results for me came back ambivalent right, which I'm really surprised by, because I answered initially in that first question that I am more for bigger government. And one of the questions asked me if I wanted more drastic changes with government programs. And I said, yes, I wanted more drastic, more robust changes to government programs. So I'm interested as to why it would put me on the right. But the ambivalent right, the caption on it saying young and politically cross-pressured, conservative on economics and issues of race and gender, less so on immigration and social issues. So I think that's interesting because, I did on the survey answer that I was for immigration. I come from a family of immigrants, and that people speaking different languages doesn't bother me at all. Of course, I come from a multilingual home. So I'm curious as to why it would put me on the right when I economically answered so far left.
Yeah, so there are obviously a lot of different dimensions at play in this type of survey, and some people are going to take it and feel like maybe this doesn't describe them well. But it does its best. The survey, the tool that we've placed online does the best job it can to balance out all of those competing attitudes. And so, as you mentioned, part of the description of that ambivalent right group is that they are cross-pressured in a way that a lot of the other groups aren't. The ambivalent right has a majority of folks who identify as or lean towards the Republican Party, but it also has a pretty significant number of Democrats in it. I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of a quarter to a third of the ambivalent right is made up of Democrats or Democratic leaners. So that is a group where people have much more mixed attitudes than, for example, the outsider left, which is sort of positioned across from the ambivalent right in the way we present these groups, but is much more consistently liberal across a wide variety of issues. And so some of the nuances here are really interesting, that the stress sideliners, the ambivalent right, there are those cross pressures, those competing attitudes. Whereas, as I said, among Democrats, there's a lot of agreement on a wide range of issues, everything from the minimum wage to taxes to the idea that more needs to be done on climate change right now. They might not agree on the details, but there's a lot of agreement on basic issue positions. And so expressing some of those competing attitudes could very plausibly lead our quiz to steer you into that ambivalent right category.
And Andrew, I just finished it, and it says that along with 6% of the public, I'm in the progressive left.
Yes,
that makes sense.
I'll take that.
Yeah, and the progressive left group is interesting. As you said, it's only about 6% of the population. That's the smallest of the 9 groups we identified. But because they are the most liberal group, and the same is true on the other side, the groups that have the people who are kind of the strongest partisan identifiers as well as the most ideologically consistent. Those are the people who are most likely to vote, to be most likely to say they follow politics closely. And so even though the progressive left is only 6% of the population, it's a much larger share of the voting public, for example.
Interesting.
So they represent a pretty significant share of the Democratic coalition, even though they look like the smallest group just in terms of raw percentages.
And we make a lot of noise on Twitter. Yeah.
Yes. Twitter we don't have stats for, but I imagine it would be an even larger share there.
Yeah, so interesting, so fascinating. So people can go and take this quiz at pewresearch.org. It is kind of down on the bottom of the page, and it talks about the typology. So people should go and take this test because it's a fun quiz, 16 questions long. So very fun. Andrew, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
All right, we will have more Rising right after this.